Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Wednesday on the Stoop, Be Gorgeous, Be Austere with Sara Davis. Sara Davis is a recovering academic and marketing writer who lives in Philadelphia. Her PhD in American literature is from Temple University, and she has recently published Flash and Cleaver, OK Donkey, and Craft. She currently blogs about books and climate anxiety at literarysara.net, and her Twitter handle is also at literarysara. If you are watching this on YouTube, check the description box for those links. And if you're watching right now live, I'm going to put that in our chat box. But otherwise, Sara, please take it away.
Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for coming on a Wednesday afternoon. I'm a longtime Wednesday on the Stoop participant, but it's really exciting to be on this side of the slideshow today. We are going to end up being a pretty large group, I think, and I have a lot of slides I want to cover. So if you don't mind, I'd like to skip verbal introductions, but if you feel so inclined, you are warmly welcome to drop a little bit of biographical information in the chat. Let us know who you are, where you're logging in from, and whether you think of yourself as a maximalist or a minimalist writer, as the workshop prompt suggested you think about. We're going to be doing a lot of self-reflection today, so it's always helpful to kind of start with a benchmark, kind of thinking about what style of writing do you think you prefer. So today I'm going to take you through two exercises that are adapted from a book by Ursula K. Leguin. You're probably more familiar with Ursula K. Le Guin's sci-fi writing, her novel Left Hand of Darkness, The Dispossessed, and a number of other ones. And this is how I came across her writing guide as well. I belong to an eco-fiction book club. We were reading The Dispossessed together, and we thought it would be fun to read Ursula K. Le Guin's thoughts on writing and craft as well. So that book is Steering the Craft, 21st Century Guide to Sailing the Sea of Story. It has just as many nautical metaphors as you could wish on the inside. There are 10 exercises here to take you through thinking about different writing elements. And if you do them alone, she calls you a lone navigator. And if you do them in a group, she calls you a mutinous crew. So that's pretty much what we are doing today. We are the mutinous crew. So feel free to embrace that identity. Let's see. So Le Guin is a novelist. So most of her advice and the examples she gives in this book are long form fiction. But we're actually going to focus on a couple of poems for our examples, and then you can use these exercises to think about any genre of writing. So let's get into why that might be. I'm going to read this quote to you about what the purpose of the exercises are, and then from here on out, I'd love to invite other people to to read out loud the poems and other things that we'll be working on. I know you'll get tired of hearing my voice in time. So Le Guin writes, these exercises are consciousness raisers. Their aim is to clarify and intensify your awareness of certain elements of prose writing and certain techniques and modes of storytelling. Once we are keenly and clearly aware of these elements of our craft, we can use and practice them until the point of all practice, we don't have to think about them consciously at all because they've become skills. So in addition to doing a little bit of free writing today, we've got a couple of writing prompts. So you'll be doing a little bit of generative writing. I think you'll also find it helpful to jot down some notes about your experience, almost like journaling or reflective writing. It's one of the reasons why I love this book so much, because I don't think we stop often enough to ask ourselves how writing feels. What comes easily to us, what is more difficult, what do we enjoy, what other emotions do we run through as we read. So that's what we are going to focus on. So let's jump in. The first exercise in the entire book is called Being Gorgeous. That's verbatim. And I love the word because it's very fun to think about ourselves as being gorgeous. So in these exercises, Le Guin's really asking us to play with language and have fun with it. And she says, use the whole orchestra our wonderful language offers us. She gives in the book a lot of examples of writers that she feels are doing this. And I'm going to bring my own example to the table just because it's a little shorter. And I think it will kind of give us a little bit to talk about. Could I have a volunteer maybe just pop off the mic and let me know if you're ready to read The Word Plum by Helen Chasen? Don't be shy.
I'll do that.
Please be my guest.
The Word Plum by Helen Chasen. The word plum is delicious, pout and push, luxury of self-love, and savoring murmur, full in the mouth and falling like fruit, taut skin, pierced, bitten, provoked into juice and tart flesh, question and reply, lip and tongue of pleasure.
I love the way you read that. I think you really kind of leaned into the pacing that the lines were asking of you. So now that you've all had a chance to listen to that and read along, this is not going to be a highly technical discussion. I'm just asking first impressions, thoughts, feelings. How do you respond to this work? How did you experience this reading of it? What are some things that come to mind? You can drop them in the chat or feel free to pop off mic and just say them out loud.
I think about the way people in England will describe a certain high-class accent as plummy.
I love that association because I think I don't know if this is what is meant by that word, but when I hear the word plummy, I do think of the way the lips and the mouth are moving, the way this poem describes, and it sounds like it would be delicious to speak in that way. What else do people notice? Oh, I see in the chat someone says very tactile. I love that because there's a lot of attention to the way things physically feel in this poem, full in the mouth, the tautness of the skin, pierced and bitten. People are saying sensual, sensuous. This is great. This is a very sensuous poem. It's one of the reasons I like it so much. So I'd love to hear from you again, out loud or in chat. What are some ways that this author is playing with language and sound to create these sensations of plumminess, of sensuality and tactility? What are some of the specific words that really stand out to you as creating these sensations?
So many conjunctions kind of joining things together, rounding things out.
Can you point to one in particular that you're looking at?
Well, pout and push, question and reply, lip and tongue.
I love that observation. I don't even think I noticed that, but since you call it out, it is this sort of pairing of ideas that go along with the idea of maybe a pair of lips or just the kind of sense of things touching. Great. I noticed in the chat, someone says all of the P words, pout, push, pierced, provoked, pleasure, absolutely tons of alliteration in this poem. And not just words that kind of repeat that sound, but also words that specifically call attention to the way your lips and tongue move when you're talking. When you say plum, like you can't help but think about the physicality of forming that word in your mouth. Great. Anything else jump out to people? Oh, all right. We've got a poet analysis in the chat. Love how the poet uses space. She pushes the luscious adjectives into the following lines rather than packing them into the same sentence. Really nice close observation there. So this solidifies and embodies and performs the act of her eating it rather than simply describing it. That's really beautifully worded. Thank you for sharing that. And kind of along the same lines, one of the things I wanted to call out, because we'll talk about pacing a little bit more, this poem is full of commas. So we've got this kind of use of space that Trivarna pointed out, and then we also have these kind of interruptions, pierced comma, bitten comma, provoked into juice comma. And to me, that does a couple of things. It forces you to slow down. And we noticed that in the beautiful way, I think it was Maureen that read it, to kind of slowing down and luxuriating in all of these sounds. Great. And it also kind of gives me the sense of this interruption. When you're reading the poem, you have to keep stopping and starting again, almost like you're getting a little breathless. That adds to the physicality of it. Fantastic. Love the enthusiasm in the chat. Great. So final question for you before we give this a try ourselves. How does the style of writing affect the meaning or impact of this poem? So we're not going to get too deep here, like we're not going to try to reach too hard, but you're all readers. You read this, you experienced it as this kind of sensuous poem that you talked about in the chat. What would have happened if she did just describe the plum, like just talked about eating a plum, maybe used a lot fewer adjectives? What would have been different?
The meaning would have been narrower and closed off, less expansive.
So one possibility, it would have been, I like your idea of the way this poem expands, because it's really about something very small, but because we had so much fun with all of these words and all of the kind of suggestive inflections of them, it does seem to expand in meaning. That's really nice. Thank you. Let's go ahead and move along, but go ahead and have that idea sit with you. Like, what would be different about this poem if it were more sparse, if it were more austere? Because then we're going to ask the flip side question when we get to the next set of poems. Okay, so in this first chapter of Steering the Craft, when Ursula K. Leguin talks about gorgeousness, she points to a few different ways of creating gorgeousness in language. And we pointed to a lot of those in the word plum. You've got onomatopoeia, which is creating sounds in words that sort of sound like they would sonically. The word plum is a little bit like that. Just again, this speaking of it, kind of enacting the action of eating it. We've got alliteration, which we had plenty of. Leguin also points to dialect. She calls out Mark Twain as a gorgeous writer because he's very attentive to the sounds of spoken language. She talks about repetition. She talks about rare or obscure vocabulary and also playful nonsense. Thinking of Alice in Wonderland or Rudyard Kipling's Just So stories. And again, Ursula K. Le Guin herself is a science fiction fantasy writer, so there's a lot of space to play with gorgeousness, with this kind of shift into obscurity or nonsensicality. She talks a lot about rhythm and pacing, as we did with this last poem, musicality, dramatic phrasing, dramatic pauses, pacing that moves you forward very quickly, that drives. As an example for that, she talks about Their Eyes Are Watching God as just a propulsive novel, just hardly lets you stop to catch a breath. And then also the pace of slow luxuriating, which is what we talked about with this poem. So now you've got a sort of toolkit to think about. We're going to move on to that first writing exercise that I'm going to ask of you. So we're going to take a really short time to do this. It might feel long or short to you. I don't know. Writing prompts always feel really long to me when they're in the moment. But we're only going to take about 5 minutes to do this. And we're going to spend a little bit more time reflecting on it. As I said, what I'm particularly interested in with this workshop is how this writing exercise gets you to think about your writing more broadly and what feels good to you, what feels difficult for you, and so on. So the prompt is to write one paragraph or so, but a paragraph's a good starting point. Just describe one action or a person feeling a strong emotion. That's it. That's the prompt. This could be anything. You could look out of your window and describe what you see. It could be something that happened to you today. It could be something from a work in progress that you want to zero in on. But just take that one scene, that one moment, and write a paragraph trying to make the rhythm and the movement of the sentences embody the physical reality that you're writing about, in the way that that poem kind of embodied eating a plum. You can use any of these tools we talked about: onomatopoeia, alliteration, repetition. You can use dialect. You can use whatever feels good to you. Try it, have fun. And she emphasizes write for pleasure and show off. So take 5 minutes to do that. I'm going to go mute and set a timer. And then when we return, I'm going to ask you a few questions for reflection, and we'll share some of our thoughts about that. Start now. Okay, that was about 5. I wonder if that felt fast or slow to you. So the next step, now that you've given this a try, you've played with language, you've luxuriated, you've been gorgeous. For some of you, that probably felt very freeing, and for others, maybe more of a strain. I'd like for you to reflect on that now, and it's your reflections that I'd like for you to share either in the chat or out loud if you feel comfortable with that. Because again, there's such a there's so many paths toward good writing, and I think when we kind of see all the different experiences that people have as writers, you start to really get a feel for, well, what makes my voice stand out in a room full of writers? What makes my writing mine? And that's why we're doing that focus. So I'd like to know, did concentrating on the sound of language kind of give you a sense of freedom, or did it feel like a constraint? Did you enjoy it? What did you or didn't you enjoy about it? Who's willing to share?
Even though I'm a minimalist, it's really fun to be expansive with language and just playful with it. So I enjoyed it in that spirit.
Thanks for that, Amy Beth. Also, I love the return to the word expansive. I think that is very true to the spirit of this exercise, to kind of go big, conceptually or literally, lengthwise. Any other experiences people want to share? I'd love to tell you about a story that came up when I was doing these exercises with my eco-fiction group that I mentioned earlier. We were kind of discussing, our different feelings about it. I really loved this exercise. Another person in the group said it felt like a strain to him. And I asked why, because what he said was, it felt like cheating. It felt like taking a shortcut. And I wanted to hear more about that. And what he said, bearing in mind that we were all environmental writers, his subject matter, he was writing about the Andes Mountains in South America, which is where he's from. And he said that going big in the language to describe this majestic mountain range, I felt like it was manipulating the reader. It felt like it was unearned. Which, you may or may not agree with, but I thought that was a really insightful way of thinking about it. Whereas I, on the other hand, was writing about my neighborhood pigeons. So being gorgeous about the pigeons was very silly and very playful, and felt like throwing a beautiful scarf over something very plain. But it also made me, much more fond of pigeons than I'm normally inclined to be. So there's that. I wonder if that resonates with anybody in the group as well. In the chat, I'm seeing from Travarna, it was freeing and challenging at the same time. Writing this way allowed for the words to morph into their own distinctive bodies and creatures. Wow, okay, love this poetic language you keep introducing to the chat, Travarna. Language is a bodied creature that seems to be speaking back to you from another place. That's so interesting. So it kind of feels like you were letting the writing kind of take on some kind of animation, some sentience. Anything else from other writers before we dip into our next exercise? We'll circle back and kind of talk about some of these things again. Great. I always love hearing back from people who work on these. So the second half of this workshop is focused on being austere. And I want to clarify that austere is my word. This chapter comes about halfway through steering the craft, actually, and the title of the exercise is called Chastity. But since I'm taking these exercises out of context and presenting them as a pair, I didn't want to present chastity as the opposite of being gorgeous. So we're going to talk about being austere, talk about being minimalist, talk about having to do without. And the things that we're doing without in this exercise are mainly adjectives and adverbs. So what Ursula K. Leguin has to say about this section is that, this is a fun conceit, the bakery shop of English is rich beyond belief, and narrative prose needs more muscle than fat. So she's, again, talking about long form prose. If you're going to be reading a very long piece of writing, or even a very short piece of writing, as we'll see with the example poem, sometimes having a lot of beautiful language can weigh you down when you want things to move forward. So this is also something to think about and play with. So again, using a poem for the brevity of it and for the fun of it. Would someone like to come off mic and read Eggs by K. Ryan?
I can read it.
Thank you.
Eggs. We turn out as tippy as eggs. Legs are an illusion. We are held as in a carton if someone loves us. It's a pity only loss proves this.
Okay. So in and of itself, or in comparison to the last poem that we read together, how do you respond to this poem? What are some of your first impressions, your first emotional responses, the first things you notice about it? You can say these either in the chat or off mic if you're willing. Thanks, Megan. In the chat, we've got, my first impression is of sadness. The brevity of it gives a feeling of longing. Okay, so kind of noticing how the form kind of helps get across this, this message, sort of melancholy message of this poem. One of the things I noticed about it is, in the context of this session, there's only one adjective in this poem, and it's tippy, which you might love or hate as a word. I'm on the fence myself, but since there are no other adjectives, how else does this poem convey that feeling of sadness, that feeling of melancholy? Oh, got a couple of things in the chat. Someone feels like something is missing. Okay, notice. Appropriate, perhaps, for a poem about loss. Someone says, it leaves me wanting more. I find myself digging deeper for meaning. Okay, I'm curious if you're willing to say more about that, Holly. No worries if not. Kind of what meaning are you hoping to find in the poem? In the chat, we also have, if someone loves us, we are held. That's also sad. Okay, so that's an interesting dichotomy here. So it's that, like, there's that loveliness of the image of being held. Everybody,
I think because you.
Oh, go ahead. I think we might have had a audio delay there.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now I can. Yeah.
You can. Okay. Just like you said, I think it only has that one adjective, so it feels a little bit less, I don't know, I guess descriptive, like the last poem was so full and indulgent, and this one kind of lets you draw your own conclusions.
Okay, all right, I love that. A little bit less indulgent. That's a kind of powerful word choice there, since we were just thinking about luxuriating in the word plum. This is a poem that lets you draw your own conclusions. Okay, I like that thought about it. I see a little bit more going on in the chat. Someone's added, are others not held like eggs? Okay, good point. Like, who are the people who aren't even experiencing the illusion of legs? Interesting. Counterfactual, the word if. Okay, that's, again, that word if doing a lot of work, as someone else pointed out in the chat. You may or may not be someone who experiences feeling held. Holly Richards, I see you have your hand up.
I also noticed that there are 11 lines in the poem, which suggests the loss of one.
Okay, interesting.
Because
An odd
a carton
number.
is always 12.
Oh, wow, I love that. What a beautiful close reading of this poem. So this odd number, and specifically one less than a dozen eggs, something is gone. And there is something gone in the poem. The last line lets us know that only loss proves, that we're held in a carton if someone loves us. Full disclosure, I heard this poem for the first time at a memorial service. So I think you all are completely on target here, thinking about that sense of someone's missing, something's missing, something should be here and isn't. Really, really thoughtful reflections from you all. Great. And then in the chat, I like how the subject and the form mirror each other here. The poem, both emotionally and visually, has a leanness to it, which is also what loss itself feels like, slim yet heavy. Again, really beautiful language, Tavarna. I love the way you're thinking about these. I kind of want to call back to how we talked about expansiveness in the previous poem. So, this is a slim poem, as we just said. It's short. There's not a lot to it, and yet there's a lot that isn't being said, isn't there? So there's almost a sense of, I would use the word expansiveness to talk about this poem. There's a sort of ambient sense that there's something going on beyond these minimal words. Any other thoughts? I saw some people coming off and on mute.
Yeah, I was just curious, what did the person before said that there's supposed to be 12 and there's -1. What is 12?
She was referring to a carton of eggs having 12 eggs. And so the fact, yeah, isn't that's so clever and thoughtful.
Okay.
And not something that I noticed on first read. So this is a really kind of, I love how we're playing with language even in reading.
Cool. Yeah.
Really nice. Okay, so kind of flipping the question we asked about the word plum. What would this poem be like if it gave you more of those adjectives, if it gave you more of that something missing that we're all kind of wanting out of this poem? What if it was chock full of adjectives and adverbs, and it was, a little bit longer than it is now necessarily, and was different in those ways? How would it feel then, hypothetically? The hypothetical questions are tough because I'm asking you to imagine a poem that does not exist in this form.
It wouldn't reflect the form of the eggs, which are very simple. There is no more simple creature in the world than this egg in a white shell.
Okay, love that. There's like the egg image itself is a very simple image, and there's a kind of confluence between the simplicity of that image and the simplicity of the poem. Nice. Other thoughts?
I think it would start to feel repetitive as they're talking about loss and possibly losing someone. And you can only, I think I've done a lot of grief writing, and I think you can only say that so many times in writing poems about missing things about a person or missing experiences, and you find your way saying the word missing a lot. And yeah. You make a really compelling point. I hadn't thought about it in the context of other poems about grief, but just thinking about the sentences of this poem, one's about eggs, one's about legs, one's about a carton and people loving us, and then only the last line kind of lets you know that this is a poem about loss and sadness, and it lands very hard after the levity and sort of simplicity of those egg silly images, silly words like tippy to talk about eggs, and then wham, pity and loss. So kind of having it be spare allows those words about loss to have more breathing room in a way. Great, fantastic. Dipping into the chat for a moment, we've got Travarna, as long as the lushness of the language doesn't overbear the loss itself and allows for the reader to enter into it and be held by the poem, Ryan's minimalism works here because its sparseness allows us space to be held. I do feel held by this poem. I'm really glad that you said that. It's lovely. Tippy and pity are near rhymes, also a nice observation. So since we're kind of tipping toward the language, we're tipping toward the language in this poem. Since we don't have a lot of adjectives and adverbs, what do we have? Just like, what words do we have that are working for us here, that are doing all this heavy lifting? You all have said them in the chat and out loud a few times now. There's only so many. We've got the eggs, we've got the carton, but we also have these really strong verbs. We are held. Someone loves us. Loss proves this. Like the verbs are very simple, but very strong. And if you reduced this poem to its verbs, you would still kind of get the gist of what it's about, which I think is very powerful. So we're going to keep that in mind while we move along. Thank you again for all your beautiful readings. I love how kind of closely into the poems you all are going. It's nice. So in this chapter, which again, I'm using as a juxtaposition to the chapter about gorgeousness, but which doesn't really play that role in the book. This is kind of a chapter for Leguin to talk about some of her pet peeves in writing. And so she doesn't really give an example of people who do austerity, or as she would say, chastity very well, but she does tell you a lot of things that don't work. So she suggests replacing adverbs with more exciting verbs and nouns, kind of tagging on to that last bit we were talking about with the verbs in Kay Ryan's poem. She gives you a couple of examples there, like instead of saying they ran quickly, they raced. Sometimes that's a great idea. Sometimes, as my marketing writers know, sometimes you have to use some words instead of other words. It sort of depends on the context. And now this part I think is really interesting in the context of this exercise. She asks you to watch out for conversational tics. And she spells them T-I-C-K-S because she says they suck all of the blood out of your writing. And examples she gives are, these are kind of like adjectives or just kind of throwaway adverbs, throwaway words that don't really do a lot to, set up what you're trying to tell. They don't carry a lot of weight, rather a little kind of just all of these things that we're used to saying out loud when we're trying to minimize our place in a conversation, but which in writing don't really do much work for us. She talks about suddenly serving this purpose. She really goes hard on the word somehow. She calls it a super weasel of a word because things never somehow happen in your writing. They happened because you made them happen. You wrote them that way. So somehow is a little bit of a cop-out, according to her. And pardon my language in this recording, but she spends several paragraphs talking about the word fucking used as an adjective or a qualifier. Doesn't do anything at all for her. It's like about as useful as saying the word which you may or may not agree with. But for this exercise, we're going to try to do without. So for the next 5 minutes, let me go off mic and take some writing time. I want you to write a paragraph of descriptive narrative prose. So once again, you're going to be focusing on one thing happening, an action, or one person doing something, kind of make it close and tight. And you want to do that without any adjectives or adverbs at all. No dialogue. You want to try to make a scene come to life using only verbs, nouns, pronouns, and articles. You can also, as an alternative, try to she's again chasten, but let's say condense a piece of writing, even the one that you just did in this workshop, and take a piece of writing you've already made and remove all the adjectives and adverbs, and then see what's left and try to polish it up a little bit and make it more vivid and speak louder. So either of those options perfectly valid. Write something new or rewrite something you've already written. I am going to start the clock and I'll see you back here in 5. Okay, that was 5. Come on back. And just a few minutes left in the hour to talk about our different experiences. So I guess obviously I have these reflection questions again for you, but honestly, the first thing I want to know is, did that feel short or long to you? Because I think we're all going to have really different experiences in regard to, is it easier to cut words out of something you've already written, or does that part take a lot of time too? You can drop your thoughts in the chat or say them out loud if you're comfortable. short period of time from Amy Beth, one of our poets and minimalists.
I got a lot out of that because it really forced me to, I guess I'm a writer that does like to throw in lots of adjectives everywhere. So this really did help me, get it down to just the necessary words and still get the meaning across. So that was a little difficult for me, but it was actually a very interesting exercise.
I love to hear that. That's great. I'm also seeing from the chat, someone says, kill your darlings. Okay, I hope you all didn't feel like you had to kill any darlings, but I understand the feeling. It makes you look your perceived cleverness in the face. How interesting, Andrea. It makes me kind of, I feel called out is what I'm trying to say, because like I love my adjectives, and if I have to take them out, what's left? I gotta polish up what's there. Holly Richards says, time yawned for me. Okay, so that felt like a lot of time to work with. Interesting. I love how different everyone's experience is. And I'm going to ask you some more personal questions. Kind of jumping ahead to the third question here. Did you find that you had any of those tics that Leguin's talking about? Any tendencies that you have for including filler words? Leguin says that hers are kind of and sort of. Mine are a little. I use the word a little like at least once a sentence in my first drafts. What were some of yours? Simply, okay. The first time I did this kind of exercise to look at my tics, it hurt my feelings. Like, sometimes things are little and I should say so, but I did not need it every time that I said it. All right, Amy Beth's suggesting just doing a search for the modifiers. Someone says just, someone says perhaps or rather, another vote for just. Rich says, I used to use really a lot until an app caught it. I use Grammarly for my work, Rich, and it does force me to kind of cut down on some of that repetition. Great, love these. So let's kind of get into thinking about, I love these kind of personal stories, but kind of thinking about minimalist writing versus the maximalist writing that we did. And I hope you're taking away from this that there's no value judgment. I clearly don't think one is better than the other. We had two beautiful poems that use really different strategies. What I'm interested in learning, or interested in you learning about, is what comes more easily for you? What did you find out about yourself while you were doing it? So some of these other questions are about that. When you had to cut out your adjectives, a couple of people mentioned in the chat that that was really hard for them. What did you end up doing instead? What was your strategy to kind of replenish the cleverness that someone said that they had to confront in their writing? Or how did you create a sense of vividness when you took your modifiers out?
Choosing crisp verbs or nouns. Yeah.
Ooh, okay. Crisp verbs or nouns. By the way, crisp, excellent adjective. We haven't been sharing our writing, Maureen, but would you mind sharing a couple of the verbs that you, or nouns that you ended up with that were crisper?
I was talking about window washing, and I painted clean the window.
Nice. Okay, great.
And glistened was another one. Glistened.
Glistened. Beautiful. I love a verb that kind of contains an image in it. That's really nice. Great. Were there any other strategies that people employed? You've probably noticed that K. Ryan in Eggs uses like a pretty good simile in there to sneak an image in. So did you find yourself leaning on simile or metaphor? Did you come up with other workarounds?
I took out some words in my writing. Did you want me to share?
Sure, if you're willing.
Yeah, I had put, I don't know if this pertains to the other words, but I had written before, I must have felt guilty about our conversation as I realized I had bought. And instead of as I realized, I'm just gonna take that out and put, I must have felt guilty about our conversation. Maybe semicolon, I had bought. And then the as I realized seemed like too much, but I don't know, is that part of?
Yeah, I think that works as an example. Sometimes when we're writing our first drafts, we're kind of reliving it, we're kind of working through it. And then when you go back and revise, you think, okay, well, I could take a shortcut. I don't have to walk them through every step of my thought process. So that's absolutely an example.
Okay.
Great. Any other thoughts about this exercise? I will share one from the chat from Travarna. Interestingly, the two ways of writing don't seem very different to me. Both of them require equipping language with the agency to enter into a landscape and to go beyond the language/landscape. It actually takes more attention to language to condense language, and silence itself is a space. I definitely agree with that as someone who, as a few of us have mentioned in the chat, those of us who write for a living as well, a lot of times in marketing and PR writing, you do really have to cut things down and say, do a lot with a little, so you really kind of have to live in that space of austerity because you only have the length of a tweet or a radio ad. I think that's part of why it's so fun to dip into the other side of it and kind of splash around in the pools of language and really play with that. So I loved hearing that. Oh, Laura adds, the removal of adjectives added more action to my scene. Good advice. No adjectives, you got to get more verbs in there. Wonderful. So I'm going to flip to one more slide, kind of getting into more of an overall reflection of these two exercises. And I'm also going to share in the chat a link to a Google document where I have these exercises and some more examples from the book, just like a little bit more meat from the book itself to share with you. If you can follow that link in the chats, and you can save that document as a copy for your own purposes if you like. But just some other kind of thoughts about this experience. Why do you think Leguin places the being gorgeous exercise first? What's the value in doing that before you do anything else about, cutting down and condensing and things like that? Or do you think that's not effective? Do you think it should be the other way around? Well, Jennifer says it's easier to cut than add. Sometimes, yes. Sometimes cutting's hard, I have to say. And then let's hear some more personal stories. Like what now that you've had a chance to kind of look at what assumptions about your writing you came in with. Now you've played a little bit with a maximalist and a minimalist style. At this point, what do you think about what style comes more easily to you as a writer? What's something that you want to spend more time challenging yourself to try? Or do you want to lean into as a personal strength? And I'm also curious too, what are your preferences as a reader? As you know, we both looked at those two poems. I kind of got the sense from some of you that you preferred one to the other. And I think that's an interesting element of thinking about our own writer's voice. What kind of writing do you want to read? One that leans toward one end of the spectrum or the other, or a little bit of both? Love that. The takeaway for me is not one or the other, but approach with play. Someone says this has raised my level of awareness of the words I overuse, always really useful. I like this. In topiary, there's a growing season for reach and a trim for growing fuller. Beautiful image. And I think one that's useful to think about in revision too. Nice. Laura says, I'm more of a minimalist and would really like to stretch for more descriptive writing. I love getting lost in poetic prose. Me too. I love some glorious, gorgeous language, but then I see something like what K. Ryan was able to do with so few words, and I think, oh, I want to learn how to do that too. So a little bit of both for me. Travarda says, I like what Ocean Vuong says here. How you say what you mean changes what you say. It's less about which kind of writing style I like more, but more about the ways in which how we embody language changes the way we see our relationship to language, its themes, and the world itself. I think that's a great point. It makes me think again of that story of my colleague from the eco-fiction group feeling like he didn't want to write gorgeously about something that was so gorgeous in real life because that felt like it just wasn't going to work for him. So I think subject matter kind of influences how we perceive these different styles as well. Absolutely. Any other closing thoughts? Here comes Ashani to tell us that it's time.
I don't want to interrupt the closing thoughts, but we are getting to that 5 o'clock slot. So I just want to extend a big thank you to Sara for this fabulous session. I learned so much. It was really, really great. And thanks again to everyone for being here. I'm also going to throw some links back in the chat for our classes, our events, future Wednesdays on the Stoop, our feedback survey, and a donation link if that's of interest to you. Otherwise, I hope that I will see you next Wednesday, and I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your week. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks to you all. You were beautiful readers. I loved it. Have a great
Thank
day.
you. This was great.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, lots of great ideas. Thank you.
Bye.